Welcome to the Honest Art Podcast. I'm your host, Jody King. As an artist for 20 years, instructor, speaker, author, and fellow rebel, I've worked with thousands of people around the world, from beginners to established artists, helping them create their strongest art and build a career doing what they love. So if you are ready to have a little fun while you learn about art, creativity, building a thriving art business, and living a bold, audacious life, you are in the right place. Also, if you're considering going pro in your art business, grab the PDF in the show notes on the 5 things they don't teach you in art school. All right, let's get messy. Hello, and welcome back to the Honest Art Podcast. So I have the incredibly talented Keren Toledano with us today, and I'm really excited to interview Keren. And I'm really excited for you guys to hear about her and her work as well, because we're both self-taught artists as well as painters and writers. You could actually have the distinction of author. I'm right now still a writer, hopefully an author, published author soon. So you've got it going on. So you're way ahead of the game in comparison, but I'm really excited to talk to Keren today and to find out about her creative outlets of painting and writing. So welcome, Keren.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, really so much for having me. I'm very excited for this.
Oh, well, I can't wait because hopefully after people hear this, or maybe even during, they're going to be able to go to your Instagram or to your website and to learn more. And when they see your art, they're going to be like me, just kind of like, holy shit, that is just incredible. And then when they learn more about it, they're gonna be so excited. I've got my cat here, so let's see how this is going to work. Well, why don't you just chill right there for a minute? All right. So, Keren, I'm going to read your bio, but then I'm going to ask you to put it in your own words, how you would refer to yourself. So, Keren Toledano is a self-taught artist based in New York City. She received her BA in English from Harvard. Is that it? Just Harvard?
Yeah.
And her MA in Arts and Humanities Education from NYU, also another incredible institution. Keren worked as a literary agent, Hollywood story editor, freelance writer, and film archivist before committing herself to a creative life. That just, like, all of that to me is a creative life, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
After what's that?
I should have rephrased that. You're right. You're right.
After publishing several short stories in literary journals, writer's block led to Keren exploring fine art. And in her first solo show, I believe in 2017, is that correct? Yeah. She coupled abstract collage with excerpts from her torn up stories, which was a reminder never to marry her darlings. I love that. Clearly, you are a writer.
I didn't write it. I wish I had. But I got it from somewhere. I don't even remember where, but I carry it with me always. I think it's, there's certain darlings that you should marry. But I think when it comes to art, it's really important to remember that these things can be taken apart and they can come back together in other manifestations. That's how I was thinking about it. Like these stories I had written, I could take them apart and sort of free the vignettes or the words or the phrases or the scenes and put them elsewhere.
I love that.
Yeah,
And
thank
I'm
you.
going to get into more of that, because I often talk about, especially with abstract work like you do. I often get the question, how do you know when it's done, and how do you know when to stop, and all of those sort of things. But one of the things I always like to talk about is you cannot hold anything too precious. You have to be able to be willing to let those things go, especially in abstract art. And so when you talked about, never to marry the darlings, that's kind of what I heard. But tell us about your creative process, because I know for me as a kid, I never thought I was an artist. I didn't go to, I didn't have to take art class. I did in 3rd grade, but that all went to shit. And then because of an art teacher I had that just let me know I wasn't doing
Similar.
it right. Anyway, tell us about your upbringing and how you, like, at an early age, were you an artist, or how did it go down for you?
So I wasn't an artist per se at an early age, but it's impossible to say that I didn't have a creative upbringing because I was surrounded by creativity. My parents are just intensely curious human beings. They're curious about the way the world works, the universe. So I was just surrounded by people who were just inquisitive and constantly asking questions and pursuing their own interests. My mom was actually heading toward being an art conservator. She wanted to restore old manuscripts. And when she decided to be a stay at home mom, which is a word I take issue with because she wasn't at home, she was out exploring the world and, investigating these new interests and taking us along on these adventures. And so I was just surrounded by that. Like she became a master quilter. She would write stories for us and then illustrate the books. And I remember I'm dating myself now, but I really wanted a Cabbage Patch Kid, and my mom was like, "Okay, I can make that." So she made me a Cabbage Patch Kid. Like it was just this creative life. And my dad, he's a retired physician, but he just loved the mechanics of things. So I'd come home and there'd be a radio just dismembered on the kitchen table, and my mom's like, "Where are we going to eat?" He's like, "Hang on, I'll put it back together." But like, it was just so wonderful to see their curiosity. That's what I grew up around. I didn't find writing until I got to college and I met other people that were like brave enough to say, I might want to do this for a living. And that's when I really felt like maybe this is something I could do because I was always trying to find the thing that I was curious about. As a
Hmm.
child, I didn't know what that was. But when I sort of went, I wouldn't say college is out in the world, but when I left my parents' house, I was able to locate my interest, and that was really other people, their interactions, how they think, why they think the way they do, and just how they interacted with each other. Writing was such a great outlet for exploring that, you
Yeah,
know.
I love that you brought up curiosity because I often talk about curiosity is where all creativity begins, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just having the courage to follow the curiosity one little morsel at a
Yes,
time,
yes,
because otherwise it wouldn't be curiosity, it would be something, I don't know, so much more blatant, right? But
yeah.
to me, curiosity is that
Mhm.
precursor to
Yeah.
creativity.
It can be a
So
little,
go
yeah.
ahead.
It can be a little thing. I'm curious about this tiny little thing, and then you delve into it and you realize how complex it is. Because everything is more interesting and complicated than we ever want to admit.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And you also brought up another really interesting point, which is that uh, you thought, oh, writing, maybe that could be, a
Mm,
career or something to do.
yeah,
And so often, any sort of creative pursuit, writing, painting, whatever,
yeah.
acting, singing, whatever that creative pursuit might
Mhm.
be, there's plenty of people along the way that let us know that that's not really
Right.
a realistic pursuit. Did that happen for you when you made that decision, or
I was
no?
in an unusual position because my parents were always telling us to just do what we were curious about and do what we thought we could find joy and meaning in. So I would test them when I was a kid, and I'd be like, "Oh yeah, well, what if I want to be an NBA star?" And of course, like I have no talent, and they're like, "Just try." I kept trying to get them to tell me to do something practical, and they wouldn't do it. And I was pre-med all through college, and I knew deep down that my parents knew that I didn't they never told me to go into medicine. And it was almost like my rebellion to say, okay, well, I'm going to do this very practical thing. Not that medicine is not a huge challenge and creative in its own way, but I never had that pushback. And so finally, when I got to college, I was like, all right, I'm going to try this. But I did understand that I needed to put it in the framework of like a way that I could make money. So I did, lean toward publishing. I did that for a bit, but there was always a job or a career path that allowed me to pursue writing. So it wasn't really like jumping off of a high dive without any water.
Right, right. And I feel the same way about painting. And when I teach a course called the Art Biz for Rebels, and one of the things I teach is
Mhm.
is that to have various different, you can stay in the painting, in the creativity, but to have various revenue streams to really support that, you don't have to completely get out and departure,
Right.
from the creativity, but it is important for sustained income to be able to have the things like what you're talking about. Was that your experience?
Absolutely. And I think maybe there's a moment when you're in your early 20s and you're like, I'm going to be a writer and I'm going to live in a little apartment in Brooklyn and I'm going to do it in this sort of cinematic way. And of course, like in reality, nobody really wants to be struggling or to make ends meet. So just you naturally gravitate toward, okay, well, I have to be somewhat practical about this. And the truth is, there are so many jobs that are open to creative people that don't ask you to depart entirely from that creative pursuit and allow you the time to do that thing. And, for me, that was like editing and freelance writing. I was a teacher in many different forms. I would even like tutor after school. And, I was never a full time classroom teacher, but I did work like in a college setting where I would do like writing workshops and, things like
Right.
that. So there's always something to do. And if you're curious, you'll always find it, you
Right,
know.
right. I completely agree. So
Mhm.
Keren, you were writing, and you said you got writer's block, and
Yeah.
that led you to painting. Tell us about, do you mind sharing that
No,
story?
no, of course. I love sharing it now because it worked out. Um, I sometimes I ask myself, like, do I still have writer's block? And I'm not sure because I think I'm so into the painting right now that my mind is moving in one direction. I would really like, moving forward to start reincorporating writing into my practice, not necessarily into my painting, but just into my life. So what happened was I was working, I think at that point I had about 5 different jobs. One of them was teaching at this college, working with college kids on their writing. And I was editing, I was doing a lot of freelance journalism. And at one point, I realized that a lot of my writing was, I had an interest in houses and homes, like buildings and locations would become very important, almost characters in my stories. Like I had this one story where the house itself becomes like a character and it appears to be like aging, like an old woman, and you don't know at the end if it's the protagonist who's just envisioning this or if it's actually the house. But so I realized at one point that I had this interest in location and the way people react to their locations. And so when I was looking for more income, I was like, apartment staging seems like a way to kind of become a voyeur into people's homes. So again, it was like this point of curiosity. And I had a lot of friends that were real estate brokers, and they were like, "Well, let's give it a try." I have this listing, so I just really took to it. I loved it. It was just a difficult business model to maintain. But what happened was I was working with these limited budgets, and I realized that I had to either buy or rent art, which is doable. But at a certain point, you're like, I'm just renting the same art and it's not really special. Why don't I just try to make it? So I started to make the art just for the projects. And I'm getting used to working with the paint. I'm just having fun. And I have this sort of very defined thing that I have to create because I know what the space needs. There was no real fear in it. And that's when, bam, like I got writer's block. It was like I had no more stories to tell, or I didn't have the language to tell them in. I have been working on a collection of stories that were revolving around these sort of like people within their spaces. And then I'm apartment staging and making paintings. And so the painting just became this therapeutic outlet to find another way to creatively express myself while the stories were on hold. Um, and so really that's where sort of the self-taught thing came in because I was just trying to learn this new skill as a way to sort of forget about writing for a minute.
Yeah,
But I was so not afraid to try because I had no expectations. I was
right.
learning this as a newbie. It was like my dad with the radio on the kitchen table. He's like, I have no idea how this thing works. Let's take it apart. So I just started to buy as many different types of brushes and paints and surfaces and just play around. And there was no fear in it.
Right.
So it made it easy to experiment.
So you've been painting now for how many years?
Well, I guess, it's going on going on 10 years is when I sort of started with the staging and playing around, but I really didn't become serious about it until shortly before that show in 2017. So I'd say like 6, 7 years,
Yeah.
I've been really serious about it.
Right, right.
I think there's a play
So
there.
I'm relating this to my own experience with writing and painting,
Mhm,
and I'm curious to know if you feel, how you feel about this, but sometimes what I say about painting is that it's it's an expression for something for which I have no words.
mhm,
And yet I also write, and then
mhm.
sometimes, and then searching for those words can often be difficult in and of
Yeah.
itself.
Mhm,
So do you feel like painting, I'm just curious because you're like, then I all of a sudden I got writer's block. So I'm curious how you feel if the paintings were maybe in lieu of the words. Is I don't know if that's
yeah.
the right.
I think so. I think I was always very hard on myself as a writer. I was always hyper editing everything before I would even let it go. Even just to give it to a trusted reader, I would have to have everything meticulously laid out. I did a lot of pre planning. It was agonizing the best way, in the way of a passion, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but I was giving myself anxiety, so I kind of blocked myself because I had these unrealistic expectations.
Right.
I think, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Um, I think that the difficulty for me with fiction writing was that I had to be both incredibly specific, like I had to create this specific vignette, this moment, and also be very, very universal and relatable. So like anybody would get it, even if they didn't have any, understanding of that particular scene. So it was this balance that was always a struggle to maintain. And so painting rather, was a way to sort of get away from the specificity and go to the general. Like you're saying, painting is more of an expression, a feeling or an emotion that we can't find words for. And
Mhm.
so I think that's why I just loved it so much right away, because I was freed from one half of that equation, which was the specificity. It's not a realistic depiction of anything, but it is in many ways like relatable and hopefully more of a general and, understandable moment.
Right.
I hope that was
That
in
makes
any
sense. No,
way.
that makes perfect sense. And which leads me to my next question, which is your your style is very specific. It's very unique to you, which is one of the reasons that I love it so much. Do you Was this a style that originally started coming to you, or was it very different in the beginning versus where it is now?
In the beginning, I think, especially because I had started with collage, it was much more geometric and ordered and organized. And I do love that. It was like I was building a house, and Um, so I think I was in many ways still doing what I was doing with the writing, which was being hyper edited and very pre-planned and structured from the onset. And I've moved into more sort of like combining that structure with a more intuitive, washy beginning. So instead of going straight to the orderliness, I was starting in chaos, which I think I was never quite able to do in my writing. I feel like the writing was always very orderly right from the onset. Um, so as I moved into this style, I think it was actually my mom who said something. She was like, I love what you're doing, and she was very supportive of it. She's like, but I wonder if you might try to just for fun do something a little less organized. And I was like, huh. And at first I was like, she hates it. She hates what I'm doing. And then I was like, no, I think it's an opportunity. And that's when I really started to just play around with being intuitive, whether it
Yeah.
was closing my eyes when I did the underlayer, or painting with my right hand, because I'm a lefty, um, or just, painting to music, and sort of seeing where my hand went, sorry, based on the beat or the sound. So it was something I had to move into consciously. It did not come naturally. And then as I started to do that, because, what I really wanted to do was create order, that came back in.
Yeah.
Um, so that's where you get the geometry on top of these sort of more, intuitive undercoats.
That's really fascinating that you describe it as order.
Hmm.
I have recently, my work is very abstract, and it's, I'll do similar things. To get out of my head, I'll put on music, and I'll move quickly too. Quick speed also helps for me to get
Yeah.
out of my head. Not always, but at different points of a painting, sometimes I'll just need to speed it
Hmm.
up faster than my brain can overcorrect me, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that
um,
makes
go ahead.
No, no, I love that. I'd never thought about pace as being a way to sort of get out of your head, just like move faster than you can edit.
Right. Yeah. At least for me. But more recently, I I have been finding like, do you know how when you're working a painting and it just feels like you're having to wrestle it to the ground? Some go really quickly and you're like, oh, look how smart and clever I am. And then others you're like, I'm a hack. I don't know what I'm doing. Right. And I find that usually I am trying to force something
Hmm.
or create maybe something that I used to, or I don't know. I'm trying to do something. It's just whatever it is, it's just not working. And so
Hmm.
more recently, I have found that I have an abstract piece and then I go in and I just put paint blocks of color on
Hmm.
top. You can still see some of the abstract behind it, but there's blocks of color on top. And
Hmm.
so I started, rather than judging myself,
Yeah.
I followed that curiosity. And then I asked myself, what is this about?
Hmm.
And what you just described as order,
Yeah.
I described for myself as safety.
Hmm.
So to me, there was safety within the just creating those blocks and geometrics of color on top. And then I
Hmm.
asked myself, all right, Jody, what's this about? Right. Because it tends to be a reflection, especially if you're painting intuitively, like you're talking
Right.
about. And I had to discern, oh, well, this is because what's happening in my life right now. And was related to my book.
Hmm.
I was sharing my book with my daughters who they were the first to read, the other than my editor obviously, and there was so much fear that when I went to show up to paint, all
Hmm.
I needed was just safety. So my blocks of color, that's what it was for
Right.
me. So I'm just fascinated to talk to you because when people, when they see your art, they're going to know what we mean by that order and
Hmm.
that, so
Yeah.
do you find that your style is continually like, or has it been very similar for a while?
Mhm.
Do you like, tell me where you are in your creative journey?
Yeah. Um, that's a very good question. I need to give it a second of thought. I think one of the issues for me is that I feel like I'm not working in a defined style. Um, I feel like
Really?
it's funny, right? We're critical of the things that nobody sees, and then we're not critical of the things that people do notice. But my issue has been like when I go on Instagram and I see people working in these very clearly defined sort of what we call a signature style. I feel like, oh no, my stuff is so all over the place. I'm using a much too broad of a palette. Sometimes I'm more geometric, sometimes I'm more intuitive. So to me, I feel like I don't have that style. So that's why it's a little bit difficult for me to put into words like exactly where I am at any
Okay,
moment.
that statement alone is going to be so relatable to so many artists who really feel like they don't have one, and yet the
Yeah.
rest of us go like, "Oh no, girl, you got your style."
Great. I'm so happy it's music to my ears. Even if you don't have a style, I think like when I started to show people my work, and I did feel like it was a lot of different things because it was part collage, it was part like, painting on raw canvas, and then there was gesso canvas. It was a lot of things because of the experimental moment that I was going through. But they would always say to me, don't apologize. I can tell that you did it. It still looks like your work. It doesn't matter if you're creating in a lot of different styles or using different mediums. I mean, that's great. That's creativity. It's still yours and it's still going to look like yours, even if you don't see it. That's what's coming across. Um, so I do feel like I'm always evolving. Like to get back to your question, I try to sort of find that balance between like dwelling in a space that seems like it's working and being like, okay, I'm going to create a series in this field and still allow myself like within that series to start to find my exit ramp to the next thing.
Right.
So there's always like right now I have a few collections at different galleries, and one of them has much more like larger like central geometry defining the shape, and the colors are much darker. And then elsewhere I'll do more of my sort of like raw canvas, kind of lighter paletted, more kind of whimsical colorful pieces. So what I
Mhm.
try to do is if I'm creating a lot of different things, just sort of put them in separate places so that wherever they are they feel coherent,
Yeah.
if that makes
That
sense.
makes total sense, and you bring up a really good point. Um, in that the different galleries that you have that
Mhm.
are representing your work, and that they each like different, you know, things that you're creating. And
Yeah. Mhm.
so when you were given your solo show, and um oh, well, shit, I wrote it down. Tell me the name of your solo show again.
It was the act, but not the thing is sacred. I know it's a mouthful, but
No, but it's so good. The act, but not the thing, is sacred. Tell us why I when I read it, I was like, that is that's poetic in and of itself. Clearly a writer. Tell us how you decided on that title for the show.
well, that was really like at the height of that was the height being like the beginning of my writer's block, which is when it really hits you the hardest.
Yeah.
And then I had this opportunity to, share these collages on a wall, and it's like, how do I express how I feel about these pieces? And um, I had felt very attached to the stories. And then I'd made this choice to literally rip them up because in many cases I used pieces of the, tea stain, like I tried to make them look aged
Yeah.
and antiqued in some way and like, use them in the collage. Um, but I wanted to get across that it wasn't the story that was sacred. It wasn't even the collage that was sacred. It was the, addressing of the what was intriguing to me about either expression of creativity and just holding on to the process of exploring it, even if it meant ripping up the story and finding a visual interpretation, because I wasn't able to ever fully do it as a story. So I think it was another way of saying, don't marry your darlings,
Yeah.
like you can be married to the process and forgive yourself for the outcome because it's never going to be perfect. You're always going to look at it and say, especially if you put it away for a minute and you come back and be like, what was I thinking? Like we all do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to not make the thing sacred, you know.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And the very act of creating
Mhm.
um, is healing in and of itself. But so often, and I don't know if, but I certainly do this for myself. So often I will decide, well, if I don't have time to make a masterpiece, or if I don't have time, because it's never, listen, every time I try to make a masterpiece,
It may be, but maybe we just don't have the capability of calling it. And maybe that's humility, and maybe that's a good thing. That we're always like,
perhaps.
oh, a little bit self-critical. I
Yeah.
wonder sometimes if we weren't at all, if we would even like ourselves. I
Right.
would be embarrassed to be that proud of what I. That sounds horrible. Maybe don't include
No, I love that. I think this is important because a little bit of self-awareness, and a little humility is really important. Can you imagine? I would just be arrogant as fuck if I was like, I love that and I love
that.
that and I'm a brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, like that, image of there's that Saturday Night Live had this old skit about Picasso where he was at that phase where he was so famous that he could just sign a napkin and be like, I'm Picasso, go sell that and go sell that. I don't know if he was ever truly like that, but that idea of an artist just being so sure of the value or market value of their work that they would be so lacking in humility,
Right.
it's uncomfortable to me, you
Yeah,
know.
that's a really interesting point. You make a great point about, that balance. Can I just change gears just a little bit, because so much of what I do is I try to empower artists to make a living, or at least make money doing what they love, which is
Mhm,
something you have done and I'm able to do, and so many artists are. We tend to hear about the many others that don't. But
mhm,
one of the things that I talk about, which we touched on a little bit earlier,
mhm,
was revenue streams,
yeah,
having various revenue streams.
mhm,
So, do you do you have, other than painting your originals,
mhm.
do you have other things that you do for a revenue stream?
Yes,
Would you mind
absolutely.
sharing those, or?
Oh, I am a huge advocate of selling high quality prints, and I stress high quality because there are a lot of mass market publishers that they're a great way to make money, but they will. I don't know how to say this other than to say that they will reflect upon your originals. If you don't want to oversell yourself, I guess is what I'm saying. So you can pick really high end, well curated publishers that maybe have like a competition involved in order for you to even sell with them. Or if you just look at their site, you would buy like 90% of what they were selling, and you have to approach them and they have to accept your work. So it's more of a curated process in that sense. If you do that and you're very meticulous about it, you can make a beautiful revenue stream. So that's something I'm a huge advocate of. I actually became involved with a company that does 3D prints. Can I
Yeah.
mention by name any company that
You're
I?
welcome to. Yeah, that'd be great.
So there's a company I work with out in LA. It's actually Portia de Rossi started it. It's called General Public Art,
Uh-huh.
and they make what they call cinegraphs, which are really, if you go into Restoration Hardware, you'll see a lot of their art is coming from General Public, and
Right.
there it's just really fat. It's obviously there's always going to be a difference between the original and a print,
Sure.
but even just being able to stand, maybe within 2 feet and see texture, like,
Yeah.
just a three-dimensional print. So that's something that I also love. It's kind of democratizing, the art space even more. So
And
these
then
again are all things. Yeah,
can I
sorry.
ask you about your prints?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there are so many different ways to do prints, and I'm really glad you brought up just kind of that mass market kind of thing, because I think
yeah.
that tends to appeal to many artists just because of the ease.
Hmm.
That's just ease. If somebody else's, they've got a third party that's packaging them and you know, what is it,
Hmm.
fulfilling all of the things. But there are other ways that you can do prints at a higher level that reflect upon you as the artist and with more esteem, your work, all of that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so because there's so many different ways to do it, I just want to ask you a couple things just because I think it would help other artists. So do
Hmm.
you limit your number of prints or is it open ended?
It depends on the publisher I'm working with. When I work with certain ones, they are working with trade accounts. So they're selling to another retail. Like I have some prints at CB2 now. So I don't believe that those are limited. Um, but it is an exclusive contract with the publisher, but I don't think it's a limited edition print. But sometimes I work with Minted, which is a company I love.
Yeah.
They will, sometimes limit. I think you also have the ability to sell your own stuff and decide whether it's limited. To be perfectly honest, I don't really do that. It's not. I feel like the whole point for me of a print is to make it accessible, and if more people want it, fantastic.
Right.
I do see the point of it, and I
Mhm.
think it works a lot better for people who have their own print shop on their website when they're
Right.
selling their own prints. It's something I think about. The only reason I don't do it is just because it's another bit of labor and time for me. And because of the way I paint, I do have to do a lot of stretching and framing. That's sort of where I put that time. Like having a print shop on my website would be more time than I can spend
Yeah.
right now. That's when I would really think about limiting the run.
Well, I
And
love this. I love it because it's a reminder that there's no one
mhm,
right way to do any of this,
yeah,
right?
and you're not married to it. You could always change your tact in a month. I could decide to start selling off my website.
Exactly. And so what you're speaking to, which I think is so important, is what is going to work for me as
Mhm,
an artist and where do I want to put our limited amount of time and resources. And what I
right.
hear you saying is I can make a great revenue stream in the way that I currently have it and I can go over here instead and put my time and energy into the stretching and the like whatever is valuable for you. So I think that's great. I'm so glad you shared that. And do you work with any third party? So you have your work in galleries. Do you happen to work with any designers or consultants or anything like that?
Yeah, so designers are something that, for early on, I was like very adamant about developing relationships with designers. I think one of the best ways to feel secure in your career, especially when you're starting out, is if you have, pretty stable trade accounts or people that you work with consistently, and you're not just sort of, you don't feel like, oh, I'm just putting my art out there for the general public and hoping that they see it or hope the Instagram algorithm likes me enough to like share my stuff. So really just making sure that every month you are spending dedicated time reaching out to people who are going to be consistent, um, you know, and mutually beneficial, work for you. So I do have designers that I know their work, they know mine, I know their aesthetic, they know mine. They'll come to me and say, do you have any darker pieces in this size? Or, we're looking for something a little bit sparser in composition. So they'll have the confidence to come to you and say, this is specifically what we need. And then hopefully you can also just build commissions out of that and be like, well, I don't have anything right now. Um, so I think sometimes like we'll look at an artist, how they're depicting their sales on Instagram, and we don't even know all this other stuff that's happening in the background, like the like you said, the decorators and the consultants that they're working with. Um,
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you shared that because there it's I've spoken about this before, but there are 4 times as many interior designers as there are
mhm,
galleries. But
mhm,
but as artists, we tend to hold as the pinnacle, the gallery, and there's nothing wrong with galleries. That's awesome, but
mhm,
we shouldn't put all of our eggs in that one basket. And by
yeah,
developing these relationships, like what
mhm,
you're saying, with all these different industries,
yeah,
is so valuable. Actually, in the art business program, I talk about like different ways to approach them. How do you know if it's a fit? Like you
mhm,
not rely, like you just said, hope is not a strategy. Just posting
yeah,
on Instagram, not a
right,
strategy. It
right.
works well for some people, but
But if
for
it's your
that
only, yeah, your only
exactly,
strategy,
it should be the only one for
yeah.
sure. Okay, so
By the way, I could talk for hours about Instagram and how I feel it can and shouldn't be used, but we can save that for another time.
yeah, social media is a big one, and so many artists have a lot of thoughts and feels on it. I
Yeah,
happen to love social media. It was where I
mhm,
first started selling my art,
yeah,
and I still continue to sell my art
yeah,
through it, but it's not the only way for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole different thing. Uh,
Well,
okay, so we're gonna give everyone your Instagram handle. By the way, speaking of social media, we're gonna put it in the show notes so that people can go and find you. But let me just ask you before I get to, we have a tradition where
mhm,
the previous guest asks the next guest a question. They don't know who the guest is, but before I ask you that question, Keren, can you share what has been your biggest challenge as an
mhm.
artist?
Well, I feel like I brought up Instagram because one of my biggest challenges has been not comparing myself to these beautifully curated feeds and, feeling like simply having what is it, a gram worthy feed is another job for me. So
Mhm.
I think just remembering that everything, and it's great that Instagram allows you to curate your life. It again is another way of democratizing the market so that you don't necessarily need a gallery. You can be your own gallery and you have control over what is portrayed. But it can be very difficult to remember that it is a curation. So that has been challenging for me to just, even just to look at somebody else's studio and be like, oh, that light or the ceilings are so high, or it's not in your kitchen or whatever it is. Um, and just remember that it's an edited version of things, and maybe it can be a bit aspirational. You can say, all right, I want to sell enough paintings to get a bigger studio, and
Yeah.
so I think for me, it's been a little bit of that, you know, fighting the urge to compare myself to where other people appear to be, and remember
Yes.
that it's more important where you are right now. So that's
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. That because that comparison thing is
mhm,
it really is a thief
yeah,
of so many things. It's the thief of our own
yeah,
curiosity, our own creativity,
yeah,
so many things.
yeah,
And that's going to be, I think, I'm going to guess 90% of the artists out there are going to be like, hell yeah, exactly. It's a soul sucking thing, but it can be just really wonderful. Also a great
it's
way.
an amazing tool. It's an amazing tool, but it's like anything. It's like, look, I love good wine. I think it's actually very useful for me in like social situations to just be a little bit more relaxed. But it's about putting limits on yourself, right? Like I don't want to let Instagram control me. I want to control the Instagram. So it's about self-limiting like those negative instincts that we have
A
to be
100%.
hypercritical.
Absolutely. And I love how you compared it to wine because I'm like,
I
yes.
would say I love a good bottle of wine more than I love Instagram, even when it
For sure. Absolutely. Every time.
every time.
Okay, so Karen, let me ask you the question from the previous guest. Okay, so here's your question. Do you believe there is a creative power that guides artists in their work? And if so, how does that play out in your creative practice?
Um, so I think that there's a creative power within every single human being, and I think it's intrinsic to us. It's not like some external, muse or something. We all have the ability to bring things into being, not as like gods. I'm not trying to, make us into deities or anything, but we create human beings. We bring people into the world. We build buildings. We cure diseases. Everybody has the capacity to be creative. So I think one of the things is, and I think it also comes from the way I was raised by both like a scientist and an artist, and understanding that, like when I was working, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but when I was working at the college, it was a school that had art, architecture, and engineering. There were only three programs. And I was teaching writing. So what was interesting to me was the engineers, because I was asking them basically to like analyze a literary text. And they would have the most creative solutions because their brains were wired to solve problems, like creative problems. Like, how do I make this building stronger? How do I make this very tangible problem go away? Or,
Yeah.
um, so I get, not to like again lose the thread. I think everybody has the ability to be creative, and you don't have to be a painter or a writer to have that power within you.
I
You know,
100% agree. One of my ex-husbands was an engineer.
yeah, they're pretty creative.
And yeah, and I used to say all the time, that is such a creative endeavor, that it's such a
Yeah.
creative career. So I'm glad you said that, because so many people go, I'm not creative, I'm not creative. Like,
And
that's
then you hate
impossible.
yourself, right? Everybody's creative in a way.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. So you now have the opportunity to ask a question for our next guest. I have no idea who it's going to be.
Mhm.
What would your question be for our next guest?
I have a bunch, but I sort of feel like the one I would most like immediately want answered is this, this development of AI technologies and how that's already impacting the art world, and uh, any potential further impacts, like what will happen to the role of the artist. Yeah, I mean, I could go on about that for a long time, but I'd be very curious to hear what other people have to say about it.
And so the question is, what role could you ask it?
Yeah, you know what? If you don't mind, like I actually wrote it down in a
Oh
much more
yeah, let's.
good way. Okay. What are your thoughts on the development of AI technologies and their impact or potential impact on artists and the art world?
I love that question, because I think we're all wondering it to some extent. Like,
Yeah.
how does this change? I have no idea what our next guest is going to say, but I will say that I am friends with a man who works in AI for Disney.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he has said, and I've also recently read it with one of the guys on Shark Tank, uh, and their take on it, again, just two people, but their take on it was creatives are going to be even more important than ever before, because there are
Right.
so many jobs that maybe analytics or things that like AI is going to be able to do those so well,
Right.
but the creatives, the ones that follow the curiosity and we have no idea where it's going to go,
Yeah.
that the creatives are going to be even more valuable. I think it makes sense.
I think like so many things, technology is a double-edged sword, and there are these bottlenecks where at any technology changes and it pushes some people out, but it also creates an opportunity for others. I think it's an inevitable thing. This is a bit like in the weeds, but but as a writer, you might. I don't know if you've ever read. There's an essay by Walter Benjamin from like the mid 20th century or earlier. Yeah, around let's say the mid 20th century, and don't quote me. But it's called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and it was sort of grappling with the moment where you could actually print your work. And we're talking now about prints as, oh yeah, that's an easy yes. Of course, we want to take advantage of that. But he was writing at a time where it was like, what happens to the value of art when we can now reproduce it, and what does that mean to the artist? So that this is not the first time that artists have had to address a change in technology. So I like that answer that Disney guy gave, that there's always going to be an opportunity for creatives to grow and, with the technology.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm gonna look into that because I really do want to read. I think that would be fascinating and so applicable. We're gonna do a whole podcast on
Mhm.
this very subject because I do think it's
For sure.
fascinating, and
Yeah.
so stay tuned for that. Okay, Keren Toledano, tell everyone where they can find you because I know they're gonna definitely want to do so.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, I am making best efforts right now to grow my email list, which is challenging when Instagram is not your major, like I feel like I've been a little neglectful with engaging with Instagram in the right way. And so I'm trying now to like move into a more of a like an email list where I can have my engaged people there. So if people would go to my website if they're interested in following my list, it's www.kerentoledano. So that's KERENTOLEDANO.com. I used to do it with the military alphabet. It's like Kilo Echo Romeo Echo
Well,
Kilo.
luckily we will put it in the show notes so people can,
Great.
just drop and some people are like, "Where are the show notes?" Just go to your podcast and look down below where where you hit play and you'll find all of this information. So they can
And
go to your website, which is beautiful, and you can also see
thank
your
you.
work, which is stunning.
And there are
And
links to all the galleries that I work with. And my Instagram is KerenToledano.art. Also
wonderful.
with two E's in Keren.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and it's so fun, with the whole writing and art piece of painting. So you're just a delight, and it's just
Thank
wonderful.
you. I wish we could talk more about your writing. Next, I hope
Well,
we'll be able to
we
speak again.
are right now. I'm in the process of querying for agents. So I'm sure you're very familiar with that process, but it's a
Yeah.
beautiful, sweet spot right now where the book is all mine,
Mhm.
so it's not, I'm not defending it or anything. It's just
Right.
mine. And I know I wrote it and it feels so
Oh, I
good.
love
So
that.
yeah, I'm kind of
I love that.
cherishing
You're a
this.
little bit married to your darling, but you're willing to send it out into the world,
Yeah,
right?
I knowing it's going to be fully picked apart, but I'm like, yeah, it's all going to
It is.
be good. Anyway, thank you so much for
Thank
today
you.
and
Really.
for sharing yourself and your art with all of us.
It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. And just a heads up, applications are now open for the next cohort of my high touch mastermind experience for artists called Studio Elite. It's a 6-month program that begins in the middle of July. It's limited in size as I work closely with each artist because let's face it, every artist is unique. The program includes weekly group coaching, monthly training, one-on-one coaching, art critiques, and an incredible community of supportive artists. Plus, and this is the best part, an exclusive in-person retreat with me and my team to mastermind and grow your art biz. If you'd like to apply for the program or just to learn more, click the link in the show notes, and I'd love to see you there.